Let's talk about some of the recent Israeli crimes here,
Sure.
Connor. We have Palestinians dying all over the place at the hands of Israeli government employees in one fashion or another. So I'm not sure where you want to start. I know there was somebody was killed in the middle of the night. Like I believe a 39-year-old man. It's unclear how he was killed. And then there were two Palestinians that were shot in a village. So where would be a good place to start here, Connor?
Yeah, well, you know what? I figure why don't we start with the Human Rights Watch report saying that that Israel committed war crimes in Gaza last May,
Okay.
because Human Rights Watch is a they're not perfect, but they've got a lot. They're a prestigious organization. So when they came out and said, I believe it was earlier this year, along with Bet Salem as well, the top human rights organization, Israel, that Israel is in fact an apartheid state, that was a huge deal. And so now they're coming out and they're saying that Israel made unsubstantiated allegations, that where they kept saying when they were knocking out those towers that housed shops and apartments and foreign and local media offices, that, oh, well, Hamas has armed personnel in there and they're using them as human shields. That's they're saying that that has not been proven. They have not provided sufficient evidence for that at all. And what this amounts to are war crimes. And as they even quote in here a Palestinian news agency that says no clear reason was seen for the bombing of high rises other than inflicting damage and hurting the population. So these are the Al Jarrah Tower, the Al Jalal Hanandi, and the Al Sharuk Tower, which including, this is a report from Middle East Eye. Middle East Eye had offices there. I mean, notably, they bombed buildings that housed Al Jazeera and the Associated Press as well. So the report says that the airstrikes violated the laws of war and may amount to war crimes. And I thought there were some good quotes here from Richard Weir, who's a crisis and conflict researcher at Human Rights Watch. And he says the apparently unlawful Israeli strikes on 4 high-rise towers in Gaza City caused serious lasting harm for countless Palestinians who lived, worked, shopped, or benefited from businesses based there. The Israeli military should publicly produce the evidence that it says it relied on to carry out these attacks. He said, as far as those accusations, that these were military targets because Hamas had human shields there, whatever, with their armed personnel. He says the Human Rights Watch report itself says that they did this repeatedly without providing evidence. And just to remind everybody that more than 250 Palestinians were killed in this, including dozens and dozens of children. I think like nearly 70, and the it even says in here that 1,500 economic establishments were destroyed or damaged. They bombed clinics. They bombed roads to hospitals, refugee camps, apartment buildings. They had strikes that hit schools. They hit water supplies, and this is a place that has most of the water is undrinkable in Gaza because of the blockade. The electricity is extremely unreliable. I think it's like 4 hours out of the day, and you can't really count on when. It's just absolutely horrific conditions. I mean, they've been starving these people virtually just to subsistence level, so that they can't be accused of starving people to the point of malnutrition. But in fact, I think there's a quote from, I forget, I don't know if it was a defense minister or not, where they said that we're not starving the Gazans, we're putting them on a diet. And anyway, it's just incredible. The Gaza's higher governmental committee for reconstruction estimated that the campaign resulted in more than $479 million worth of losses. And also, I think it's important to remember that they destroyed nearly 17,000 homes in that 11-day bombing campaign in Gaza.
And I believe
So,
Will Porter, I think it was Will, talked on the show about how there were some Israeli forces that came out afterwards and said that this was, they bombed the towers out of frustration, with just like they weren't
yeah,
able to actually hit any useful Hamas targets. And I'm not quite sure if that is, proven to be the case, or, maybe some pilots said that, maybe that was misreported, but it definitely seems like it could be an investigation into war crimes. Now, what's happening in the West Bank, right? Because that's where some of these
yeah.
raids are still going on.
So we've got, yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, there's a few of these stories. So you've got, yeah, what you were saying, there's a report from the Reuters Newswire. Israeli troops shoot dead Palestinian in the West Bank, according to the health minister, the Palestinian Health Ministry. And this is from yesterday. Now, this to me, based on what we know, I wouldn't say it's an execution, but I mean, you people, I'll just tell you what it says, and you make your own. You decide for you interpret it how you want it, but this is all we know so far. Israeli troops shot and killed a Palestinian in the occupied West Bank overnight. Palestinian Health Ministry said on Wednesday. Village residents said there were no disturbances or clashes in the area at the time of the shooting, which occurred near the village of Bet al Tata, west of the city of Ramallah. The man was returning from work in Israel. He was shot, they said. The residents identified the deceased as a 39-year-old man who lives in the village but carries Jerusalem ID papers, allowing him to cross freely between Israel and the West Bank. The health ministry did not provide further details, and the Israeli military said they were looking into the incident. So, I mean, that's essentially all we know at this point, but I don't know. That's not uncommon. I mean, for the occupation to just kill people, like you said. I mean, they've been stepping up violence in the West Bank quite a bit. If you read Ramzi Baroud, it sounds like they're concerned that there's a new intifada on the rise, because quite frankly, this whole strategy of dividing up the Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, since especially the war on Gaza in May, has been kind of there's been a substantial increase in unity amongst the different people there who are putting aside their factionalism and, as Ramsey characterizes it, self-serving, self-serving political discourses. As he says, the questions are how, where, and when. So he goes through, and I thought we'd talk about this because this is a really great article people should read. It's called Blood for Blood on Jenin and Israel's Fear of an Armed Palestinian Rebellion. So last week, you and I covered a story about an Israeli raid on this Jenin refugee camp where they shot 8 people and killed 4 young men between the ages of, I think, 19 and 21. And 2 of the bodies were stolen by the Israeli forces and have not been returned. They're using this, this is a common thing, but as he says, it's sort of a bargaining chip to put psychological pressure on the occupied population there. And so he talks about the history of Jenin, which is sort of synonymous with resistance against the occupation. So this is a refugee camp that has 12,000 people in it now. The camp was really sort of founded in 1953, and it was formed in 1953. This is only a few years, 5 years after the Nakba, the expulsion of about 750,000 Palestinians from historic Palestine, and sort of the creation of the state of Israel in what's called Israel proper today. And so he talks about how these kids were, he goes, they were toddlers or newly born when the Israeli army invaded Jenin in April 2002. And so Ramsey wrote a book about this called Searching Jenin, and he talks about how in the massacre of Jenin, or what's called sometimes the Battle of Jenin, at the end of the battle, Israel seemed to have entirely eliminated the armed resistance of Jenin. Hundreds of fighters and civilians were killed and wounded, hundreds more arrested, and numerous homes destroyed. And he says, based on statements by Israeli officials and army generals, the objective was to teach Jenin a lesson, one they hope would be understood by other resisting Palestinian areas throughout the West Bank. And so he says that essentially that the situation has changed since the war on Gaza, that all these different formerly sort of disparate factions are now coming together and really sort of inspired by the stiff resistance in Gaza. It's had, as he said, a direct impact on the various fighting groups in the West Bank, which had either been disbanded or marginalized, which is why, I don't know. Sometimes they make these accusations and they're not true, but at the same time, there seems to be there is more armed resistance happening in the West Bank against these attacks from the Israeli occupation forces. And so people, especially young men, are starting to shoot back or at least defend themselves when they're attacked
I
in
guess
these refugee camps at night.
I guess one way to say it though is it seems like this is in response to an Israeli escalation too. It's not necessarily that it's just the Palestinians are tired of the same old. The Palestinians are fighting back more as Israel is escalating their aggression against just regular old Palestinians and children and stuff like this.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, listen, I mean, like 76 children have been killed in Palestine just this year. They've demolished like 600 houses in the West Bank and East Jerusalem this year so far, including, I think, nearly 100 in East Jerusalem. We're going to get to this story in a minute. A teenage boy died over the weekend demolishing his neighbor's home, because when they demolish your home, because they say, oh, you didn't build it with a permit, they charge, or the settlers are taking this land, they charge the Palestinians a fee to have the municipality demolish the home. It's just absolutely disgusting. Absolutely. So I think it was the numbers like 764 people have been injured so far in these different raids that have been going on. 10 people have been killed in Jenin alone this year, including 8 just since the end of the war on Gaza in May. So no, absolutely. I'm just saying that there seems to be some resistance forming.
Right.
Better late than never, and that's frankly good to see. I mean, I didn't want to editorialize too much, but it's frankly, we're seeing that, as he says, Ramsey says the Israeli military understands that the May war and uprising have triggered an unwelcome transition into Palestinian society. Long suppressed, occupied Palestinians are ready to rebel. They're eager to move on beyond the Abbas and his corrupt clique, past the stifling factionism. The questions are how, where, and when. Precisely why Israel is back in Jenin, once more trying to teach the nearly 12,000 refugees there a lesson, one that is also meant for Palestinians throughout the West Bank. Israel believes that if the nascent armed resistance in Jenin is suppressed now, the rest of the West Bank will remain quiet. And then he cites a Palestinian journalist who talks about like I just said, that 10 of these people have been killed and 8 just since that war in May. And he says that the increased number of casualties among the Palestinians last few months, he says the reason for this, there's 2 main reasons. He says the increased number of Israeli raids where occupation soldiers, who often disguise themselves as Palestinians, enter the camps, refugee camps at night and attempt to capture young Palestinian fighters. And second, the growing number of youth enlisting in various resistance groups. He says the rifles carried by these youth are purchased by the young men themselves, as opposed to being supplied by a group or faction. And when they were carrying the 2 young men who were killed, whose bodies weren't stolen by the occupation forces after this raid, when they were murdered, I think 2 weekends ago at this point, he says that they were saying some of the chants were blood for blood, bullet for bullet, fire for fire. And he says the fact is Jenin once more is openly championing the armed struggle option and sending alarm bells through occupied Palestine. And Israel is worried that an armed intifada is in the making, and Abbas knows very well that any kind of intifada would spell doom for his authority. And that's essentially, it sounds like Jenin has a rich history of this kind of resistance. And so this is, as he says, there's sort of the story of Jenin, he says, is kind of it's very much relatable to the rest of the Palestinian struggle, because this is a very unique story as well, and the people of Jenin and their resistance carries a lot of weight with the rest of the occupied population there in the West Bank. So I think that's one reason why we see now, as you said, there was, Bennett is saying, I'm going to continue to expand the settlements. I think there were what was it? I don't remember if they announced it. I think it was thousands of new settlements that are being built recently. I think they reduced the number from like 3,000 something to
it was to like 2,200, and then they also said they're going to let the Palestinians build 1,000 homes. But for some reason, Connor, I think only some of those homes would get built. And then we had 2 more Palestinians killed by the Israelis recently too, right?
That's right. Let's see. So. 2 more. Let's see. I have. The boy who was in Gaza. Yes, absolutely. My mistake. So in Jerusalem, yes, this young man, 17-year-old Ali Berkwan. This is the young man I was talking about earlier, who was helping his neighbors demolish their home so that they wouldn't have to pay to demolish their own home. A wall fell in on him and killed him.
Okay.
And so as he says, he says here's some statistics to go over. He says, actually, I already covered some of this stuff. But
right. What about the boy that died at the Gaza protest then?
Oh, well, I'll get to that too, but I just want to say that as he also meant, they also mentioned this article here at Mondo Weiss that in as well in East Jerusalem they demolished earlier last month now that they demolished a one-story building that included 4 families, displaced 15 people, which the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that settlers own the land on which the houses were built, and of course, this is just a completely rigged apartheid system. I mean, and you have let's see, the families were given 20 days to evacuate their homes. They disputed the decision, according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, saying they bought the home back in 1952. And as well, in mid-August, an elderly Palestinian man from Bet Hanina had a stroke after an Israeli court ruled in favor of Jewish settlers, transferring the rights to his home to a settler organization and forced his family to destroy their home. So then, as far as Gaza goes, yes, there's a young man who's either 13 or 12. They're sort of differing. It sort of differs in the different reports, but he was shot in the neck, in the front of the neck, and went through the back of his neck, maybe by that sniper who died recently after he was shot by after he was that guy was shooting at children. We covered this last week.
Right.
It might have been that same guy. But yeah, so no, this young man was named Abu al-Nil, and he died. He succumbed to the gunshot wounds that he was from back during the protest. He died on August 21st. And they say that he was hundreds of feet away from the perimeter fence, observing the demonstrations. This is what the DCIP, which is I want to make sure I get the acronym right. It's the Defense for Children International Palestine. They reported that, yes, he was 70 to 100 meters away from the perimeter fence, observing the demonstrations when Israeli forces shot him in the throat, essentially. At 5:30 p.m. He lost conscious instantly. An eyewitness told DCIP the bullet entered the front side of his neck and exited the back side, damaging his windpipe and carotid artery and stopping his heart. He was in the ICU for a week until he succumbed to his wounds. He's the 73rd Palestinian child to be killed by Israel since the start of 2021.
Wow. Well, absolutely horrific, Connor.
They bombed Gaza this week as well.
Right. I was going to
Sunday.
Gonna ask about that too. There was also bombs dropped on Gaza. They claim it was because of Hamas, but it seems like dropping bombs because somebody sent a balloon with something flaming on it over a wall and started a little brush fire is a little absurd. But is that exactly what happened here?
That's essentially. I mean, this is again from the news wire on Reuters, and yeah, I mean. They say this every time they do this. They go, "Oh, we're bombing tunnels and we're bombing weapons manufacturing facilities, whatever." But yeah, they claim that in the middle of the night, people were hurling explosives and burning tires. That's what the Israeli military said. And always keep in mind, this is a concentration camp essentially. So and yeah, I mean, like what I mean, and again, there's no casualties on the other side. I mean, at the worst, they say that you started some brush fires in some fields or something. Usually, when they're talking about these so-called incendiary balloons. But yeah, no, they bombed Gaza. Although there were no casualties reported in the bombings in Gaza, they did say that the military responded to these people who gathered along what they call the frontier. During the night that I mentioned earlier. They say they responded with riot dispersal means, and Gaza medics said at least 6 Palestinians were hurt, 1 seriously. And then a few hours later, they launched airstrikes in a pre-dawn attack.
All right. Well, I mean, Connor, this is all bad news for the people in, Palestine and Gaza particularly. But maybe a little bit of like sunshine on the horizon, where I saw 50% of Americans now support conditioning aid to Israel. Now, I'm not so sure if you told them that, Israel wouldn't meet any of those conditions, so that this would mean cutting aid to Israel. But this is definitely a huge step in the right direction. So what's going on here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got from 2021, the Chicago Council survey found 50% of Americans want the U.S. to restrict military aid to Israel. It showed a majority of Democrats want that aid restricted. So it's split. It's interesting because it's split right down partisan lines, and it's almost virtually the opposite. So 62% of Democrats think Israel should prohibit its use in military operations against Palestinians. 32% are opposed to the idea. While Republicans 32, or in the case of Republicans, 32% are in favor of restricting aid, and 61% oppose those measures. So they also talk about how the study shows that 56% of Americans said an independent Palestinian state, sort of along the lines of a legitimate version of the two-state solution, an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, was acceptable. But 60%, I think it's interesting that they frame it this way, a one-state solution in which Israelis and Palestinians are treated as equal citizens was acceptable. Because if you said that to the American people, who, generally speaking, I would hope that if it was more clear to them what was going on vis-a-vis who's occupying who there and what the reality of the situation is on the ground, that Americans would oppose it. So when it is, presented to them like that, well, how about equal rights for both Israelis and Palestinians? Of course the American people are going to support that. You know what I mean? And this is, as they say, part and parcel with some other figures and polls we've been seeing this year. There was a Gallup poll in March that said a majority of Democrats believe the U.S. should be exerting pressure on Israel, not Palestine. A Jewish Electorate Institute poll, this one made the rounds in the news quite a bit, that a quarter of American Jews believe Israel is an apartheid state, and 34% think Israel's treatment of Palestinians is akin to anti-black racism in the U.S. And I'll just say that they mention also that, Betty McCollum, the Democratic House rep from Minnesota, has a bill called H.R. 2590, which aims to condition U.S. military aid to Israel. And she says it's currently only backed by 29 other Democrats. So the report, this is Michael Aria at Mondo Weiss. So he's making the point that the American people are getting better on the issue, but it's not exactly catching on. It's not being we're not seeing that change represented in our politics here at home. But I will say this, that she says this is pretty good. She says U.S. assistance intended for Israel's security must never be used to violate the human rights of Palestinian children, demolish the homes of Palestinian families, or to permanently annex Palestinian lands. She said this after introducing the legislation last April. She says peace can only be achieved by respecting human rights, especially the rights of children, and this includes the U.S. taking responsibility for how taxpayer-funded aid is used by recipient countries, Israel included. Congress must stop ignoring the unjust and blatantly cruel mistreatment of Palestinian children and families living under the occupation.